A wealthy businessman invited his receptionist to an exclusive gala, but what she did left everyone stunned. James Cooper, CEO of Cooper Global, was facing one of the most crucial nights of his career. His billion-dollar company was drowning in scandals. Accusations of exploitative work conditions and unethical business practices were all over the news. Investors were pulling out, and the media had painted him as a cold, unfeeling leader. This gala was his last chance to rebuild trust and secure crucial support. Every single detail had to be flawless. As James reviewed his strategy, his assistant, Greg, interrupted him. "Sir, we have a problem. Megan just canceled." James looked up sharply. "What do you mean she canceled?" "Family emergency. She won't be attending the gala." Frustration surged through him. Megan was his ideal choice. Charming, sophisticated, someone who embodied success. "So, what's the solution, Greg?" "We don't have time to find a replacement." Greg hesitated before suggesting, "Maybe someone from the office?" James scoffed. The idea seemed ridiculous, but time was running out. He glanced through his office window into the lobby, where Emma Taylor, the receptionist, was speaking to a delivery person, sorting packages, with a firm but calm presence. Something about her simplicity, her quiet elegance, caught his eye. "Bring her to my office," he ordered. A few minutes later, Emma stepped in, clearly trying to mask her nerves. She had never spoken to the CEO directly before. "Mr. Cooper?" she greeted him politely. James studied her for a moment, assessing her like a product. "I need you to accompany me to a gala tonight. It's an important investor event. Your role is simple. Smile, be polite, and most importantly, don't speak unless necessary. Understood?" Emma was taken aback. The request felt more like an order. It wasn't part of her job, but she recognized an opportunity when she saw one. "Yes, sir," she answered firmly, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was signing up for. James turned to Greg. "Make sure she looks presentable, something elegant. We meet at 7 p.m. sharp. Don't be late." By 7 p.m., Emma was ready. She wore a sleek navy blue dress that subtly highlighted her poise and confidence, though she still felt out of place. James, waiting impatiently in his car, gave a brief nod of approval when he saw her. "You follow instructions well," he remarked. "Let's go." The ride was silent. Emma tried to make sense of why she was chosen, while James mentally prepared for the evening's discussions. Upon arriving at the Grand Hotel, James turned to her before stepping out. "Remember, be discreet and professional, nothing more." Emma didn't respond, but inside, she felt a quiet determination. This was her moment to prove she was more than just a receptionist. As they walked through the lavishly decorated entrance, Emma felt the weight of countless eyes on her. This night wasn't just about saving the company, it was about redefining herself. The ballroom was a dazzling display of wealth and power. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits radiated influence. James carried himself with his usual composed authority, while Emma, though nervous, maintained impeccable posture. Whispers followed them as they entered. Who was the woman at the CEO's side? Many assumed she was an escort or a paid companion. Emma felt the silent judgment, but ignored it. "Stay close," James murmured, without looking at her. "Of course, sir," she replied, keeping her tone professional, though her confidence was growing. Soon, a group of key investors approached, led by Oliver Hayes, a business magnate known for his sharp insight and progressive vision. James greeted him with a firm handshake, but Oliver's eyes quickly flicked to Emma with curiosity. "And who might this be?" Oliver asked, his polite smile not hiding his interest. Before James could respond, Emma spoke with quiet confidence. "Emma Taylor, I work at Cooper Global." James's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. "Interesting." Oliver seemed genuinely intrigued. "And what's your take on the company's current situation?" All eyes turned to Emma. This was her moment. Emma felt the weight of the question. It was the kind that could easily be a trap, but she also recognized it as an opportunity. I believe every company faces challenges, she began, carefully choosing her words. But I also see the potential for real change, especially when the focus extends beyond profits to the impact on people. For a moment, there was silence. The investors exchanged glances, surprised by her response. James, visibly tense, pressed his lips together, clearly uncomfortable. As the evening progressed, the discussion shifted toward corporate social responsibility. James, ever the strategist, spoke in terms of numbers, financial projections, and investor confidence. But Oliver, dissatisfied with the surface-level approach, turned his attention back to Emma. "Miss Taylor, since you work at the company, what's your take on how we can regain public trust?" Emma could sense James's unease. She knew answering might upset him, but she also knew this was her chance. "It takes more than marketing campaigns," she said, meeting Oliver's gaze. "It requires genuine listening, understanding the concerns of employees and customers, valuing their experiences, and taking meaningful action beyond just numbers. That's how trust is truly earned." The room fell silent again, until Oliver let out a short laugh. "Finally, someone with a fresh perspective," he remarked. A murmur spread through the group, several investors nodding in agreement. James, now clearly irritated, attempted to steer the conversation back under his control. "Emma isn't familiar with the complexities of large-scale leadership," he said stiffly. "She was simply here to observe." Oliver, unfazed, smiled. "Sometimes an outside perspective is exactly what's needed, James." By the end of the evening, Emma had captured the attention of nearly every major investor in the room. Many approached her, praising her insight and clarity. James, however, barely spoke a word to her on the way back to the car. Once inside, the silence was thick with tension. Finally, James spoke, his voice tight with frustration. "You completely disregarded my instructions." Emma turned to him, her expression calm. "I only answered the questions I was asked. I didn't do anything wrong." James gripped the steering wheel, his frustration evident. "You drew unnecessary attention. That's not acceptable." She didn't respond. Deep down, she knew she had crossed a line, but she also knew she had left an impression on the right people. As she gazed out the window, watching the city lights blur past, she had a gut feeling that this night had changed everything, for better or worse. The next morning, tension filled the office at Cooper Global. Emma arrived on time, but the buzz in the hallways made it clear that word of last night's events had spread. Some colleagues looked at her with curiosity, others with approving smiles. But she knew there was only one opinion that truly mattered, James Cooper's. At exactly 9 a.m., a message popped up on her screen. "Emma, my office. Now." "James." She took a steadying breath, stood, and made her way to his office. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, James stood by the window, hands in his pockets. His tone was cold and direct. "Sit." Emma complied, maintaining her composure. "You defied my instructions last night," he said without turning around. "I told you to be discreet. Instead, you became the center of attention." She frowned, but kept her voice steady. "I answered the questions I was asked, Mr. Cooper. I did nothing wrong." He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It's not your place to decide what is or isn't appropriate in this situation. Your job was to accompany me, not to offer opinions." Emma felt frustration rise in her chest, but held it back. "If my answers helped improve the company's image with the investors, then I played a positive role." James tapped his fingers against the desk, a subtle yet final gesture. "You don't understand. I can't afford distractions." His next words landed like a punch. "You're fired." Even though Emma had half expected this, hearing it still stung. But instead of protesting, she simply met his gaze. Emma rose from her seat, maintaining her composure. "Understood," she said, her voice steady. Though calm on the outside, her eyes held the quiet resilience of someone who refused to be defeated. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the office. That afternoon, as she packed up her belongings, her phone rang. She almost ignored it, but the unknown number caught her attention. After a brief hesitation, she answered. "Miss Taylor, this is Oliver Hayes. Could we meet for coffee? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Oliver, one of the key investors from the Gala. Intrigued, Emma agreed. An hour later, she found herself sitting across from him at a nearby cafe. "I'll get straight to the point," Oliver said, folding his arms. "Cooper Global needs new leadership, especially in its European division. I was impressed with what you said last night, and I believe you have the right qualities for a significant role there." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you the position of CEO for the European division," Oliver confirmed. "The board will need to approve it, but I expect that to be a mere formality." She hesitated for a moment. The offer was massive, almost too good to be true, but after being overlooked for so long, the chance to lead something meaningful was too tempting to refuse. "I accept," she said with conviction. 2 days later, James Cooper received news that left him fuming. Oliver Hayes had officially nominated Emma Taylor as the new CEO of Cooper Global's European division, and the board had approved it almost immediately. This meant that while she was technically still accountable to the larger board, she now had significant influence over corporate decisions, on an equal level with James. Let's play a game for those who only read the comments. Type McDonald's in the comments. Only those who read this will understand. Now, back to the story. When James learned that he would be required to attend a meeting led by Emma to discuss alignment between divisions, his irritation was palpable. He had known he would have to deal with her again, but he hadn't expected to face her as an equal. The meeting was set at Cooper Global's headquarters. Emma arrived with an air of quiet confidence. She was dressed sharply and carried a neatly organized portfolio of documents for her presentation. When she stepped into the conference room, James was already seated, surrounded by senior executives. "Miss Taylor," he greeted her with a forced smile. "Or should I say, CEO Taylor?" "Just Emma is fine, Mr. Cooper," she replied coolly before beginning her presentation. Throughout the meeting, she spoke with clarity and authority, laying out plans for ethical and transparent business practices. Some executives voiced their support, while others, clearly aligned with James, expressed skepticism. After the meeting concluded, James approached her privately. "Impressive presentation," he said, his tone laced with irony. "But I hope you realize that implementing these ideas in practice won't be as easy as you think." Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "I never expected it to be easy," she said. "But I know how to handle obstacles, Mr. Cooper." They locked eyes, the air between them charged with tension. Neither was willing to back down. But beneath the rivalry, there was an unspoken mix of respect and challenge. As Emma walked away, James realized something. Dealing with her would be far more complicated than he had anticipated. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't shake the memory of the fire in her eyes. For Emma, stepping into the role of CEO for Cooper Global's European division was just the beginning of a much bigger challenge. Emma knew James Cooper wouldn't make things easy for her. Internal resistance would be constant, but her resolve to bring meaningful change and prove her worth was far stronger than any obstacle in her path. On the other hand, James watched Emma closely. He couldn't decide whether he respected her boldness or saw her as a direct threat to his authority. A confrontation between them felt inevitable. A week after their first major meeting, Emma scheduled a virtual conference with division executives, including James. The agenda was clear: to align all units with a new corporate ethics policy, emphasizing social responsibility and transparency. True to form, James joined the meeting late, casually adjusting his tie as if the delay was intentional. Emma didn't acknowledge it and continued her presentation, outlining how the policy would be implemented. "This initiative will require a cultural shift within the company," she stated calmly, "but I believe it's necessary to rebuild public trust and improve employee retention." James leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for his moment. When Emma opened the floor for questions, he was the first to speak. "This sounds idealistic, Emma," he remarked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "But have you considered the financial impact? The last thing we need is to strain our budget with changes that may not yield returns. Emma remained composed, a flicker of defiance in her gaze. Numbers are just one piece of the puzzle, Mr. Cooper, she replied. Right now, our greatest cost is the damage to our reputation. Every dollar invested in transparency will be repaid through market trust and the retention of top talent. A murmur of approval spread among some executives, and James realized he was losing ground. When Emma moved on to explain the action plan, including internal audits across all departments, James interrupted again. Internal audits? Sounds like we're setting ourselves up to create more problems than we can fix. Emma met his challenge head-on. We've been ignoring these problems for years, Mr. Cooper. Pretending they don't exist won't make them disappear. The room fell into a tense silence as executives exchanged glances. It was clear the leadership team was divided. As the meeting wrapped up, Emma addressed the room one last time. I understand that change is uncomfortable, but if we want to stay competitive, we need to look beyond short-term profits. This is an investment in the company's future. James said nothing, but his expression left no doubt. The battle was far from over. After the meeting, he lingered in the hallway, waiting for her. When she stepped out, he blocked her path. "Do you actually think you can give me orders?" he asked, arms crossed. Emma studied him for a moment before responding. "I'm not giving orders, Mr. Cooper. I'm proposing changes that benefit the company as a whole. If that feels like a threat to your authority, maybe the real issue isn't my proposal." James took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Careful, Emma. You're stepping into dangerous territory." She didn't flinch. "Don't underestimate me, James. I've been fired before for speaking my mind, but that didn't stop me from getting here. If you think intimidation will work, you're misjudging the wrong person." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Their eyes locked. More than just professional tension hung in the air. James felt a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration for her tenacity, while Emma sensed that behind his arrogance was a man afraid of losing control. In the days that followed, the tension between them became evident to everyone. While Emma focused on implementing reforms in the European branch, James used his influence to slow the process down. Despite his efforts, she gained more support among executives. Her transparent leadership style and willingness to listen made her an approachable figure, starkly different from James's rigid, authoritarian approach. By the end of the week, Emma received a notification. James had called a board meeting without informing her. She knew he was planning something, but she was ready. While reviewing her notes for the meeting, one thought crossed her mind. If James thinks he can take me down, he's about to learn a lesson. The news of James's unscheduled meeting reached Emma as she finalized the rollout timeline for the new ethics policy. She knew he wouldn't openly challenge her without cause, but she suspected he was orchestrating something to weaken her position. The next morning, she arrived early at the conference room, determined to counter whatever move he had planned. As board members took their seats, she remained calm, even when James walked in with a self-satisfied smirk. "Good morning, everyone," James began once the room had settled. "I called this meeting to address concerns about the financial risks tied to the new policies." Emma took a steady breath. She recognized this for what it was, an attempt to discredit her. James presented a series of charts and graphs, highlighting the projected costs of audits and procedural changes. He used words like impractical and high risk, framing the initiative as reckless and financially unsound. When he finished, all eyes turned to Emma. She stood up, took a marker, and walked to the whiteboard. "Let's talk about real costs," she said, ready to fight back. Emma stepped up to the whiteboard and drew a bold line down the middle. "On the left," she said, writing as she spoke, "we have the financial losses from lawsuits, reputational damage, and employee turnover over the past 3 years." She turned to the right side. "And here, we have the estimated costs of implementing the proposed changes." Holding the marker firmly, she faced the room. "Now, let's be honest. Which of these costs is more sustainable in the long run?" The room fell silent, broken only by quiet murmurs of agreement. Emma seized the moment. Ignoring these issues isn't a strategy, it's a liability. If we don't address them now, we'll be dealing with even greater consequences later. As she spoke, several executives began nodding in agreement. Among them was Robert McCain, one of the board's senior members, who had remained silent for months. "She's right," Robert finally said. "We've looked the other way for too long. It's time we take a more responsible approach." James attempted to regain control of the discussion, but Robert's influence was considerable, and more executives started siding with Emma. By the end of the meeting, it was clear James had lost key support. However, he didn't show any signs of frustration. Instead, he gave Emma a calculating look before leaving the room, as though already planning his next move. In the weeks that followed, James quietly worked behind the scenes. He leveraged his network within the company, delayed budget approvals for initiatives under Emma's leadership, and justified his actions as necessary financial precautions. But Emma knew exactly what he was doing, an attempt to undermine her progress. Still, she refused to back down. She found ways around the roadblocks, seeking direct board support and exploring alternative funding methods to keep her initiatives moving forward. Every challenge James threw at her only seemed to fuel her determination. During a weekly meeting, their rivalry reached its peak. Emma was presenting early results from a pilot audit at one of the European branches, showing a notable increase in employee satisfaction. James interrupted. "And what about the impact on profits? Or are you conveniently leaving that out?" Emma met his gaze without flinching. "I'm presenting measurable progress," she said. "Financial reports, as always, will be reviewed in the quarterly assessment." James smirked. "How convenient." Emma took a steady breath. "What's convenient, Mr. Cooper, is using financial concerns as an excuse to avoid necessary change." The room went silent again. Emma's unwavering stance made an impression, but it also deepened the rift between her and James. Their rivalry extended beyond the boardroom. At a corporate leadership panel, both were invited to speak. James took the opportunity to subtly undermine her. "Leadership," he said smoothly, "is about decisiveness. You can't please everyone, and tough choices must be made." When it was Emma's turn, she spoke with quiet confidence. "Leadership is also about adaptability and empathy," she countered. "The best leaders don't resist change. They embrace it and make it their strength." The audience noticed the tension between them, captivated by their dynamic. Despite their constant clashes, something unexpected began to emerge. Beneath the sharp words and power struggles, there was a growing sense of respect. Emma recognized James's strategic mind, while he, though reluctant to admit it, admired her relentless vision. In unguarded moments, their glances lingered a little longer than before, but neither was willing to acknowledge what was shifting between them, at least, not yet. One evening, while reviewing reports in his office, James found himself distracted, thinking about Emma in a way that unsettled him. At the same time, in her own office, Emma realized that despite their conflicts, her perception of James was beginning to change. The weeks ahead were filled with tense encounters and unexpected moments. The conflict remained, but so did an undeniable connection neither of them could ignore. Everything changed when an urgent business trip came up, one that required both of them to travel together. It was a strategic crisis at a European branch, and as key stakeholders, Emma and James were assigned to handle it. The flight began in silence. Emma focused on reviewing documents, while James, seated beside her, stared out the window, lost in thought. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice laced with provocation. "Ready to face the tough questions?" Emma didn't look up. "I'm always ready." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. He hadn't expected such a quick response. Throughout the trip, their exchanges were sharp but different. Less hostility, more curiosity. When they arrived at the branch, the meeting with local managers revealed an unexpected problem. Productivity numbers were lower than expected, and leadership claimed that Emma's proposed changes were causing resistance among employees. James, ever direct, wasted no time pointing it out. "I warned you," he said, arms crossed. "Drastic changes create pushback." And now, here we are. Emma didn't back down. It's not the changes causing this, James, she countered. It's the lack of communication. We need to listen to what employees are actually saying. Determined to find a solution, she turned to the team. If we want these changes to work, we need to understand their concerns firsthand. For the first time, James watched her not as a rival, but as someone who might just have the right instincts. Emma arranged a feedback session with the branch employees, and though James was reluctant, he decided to attend. At first, the atmosphere was tense. Employees hesitated, wary of the leadership and uncertain about the changes. But as they began voicing their concerns, a pattern emerged. They felt disconnected from management and feared how the new policies would affect them. Emma took charge, listening attentively and offering adjustments that balanced the employees' needs with the company's goals. James, though skeptical at first, couldn't help but be impressed by her ability to mediate the discussion and create a cooperative environment. After the meeting, the two went to a nearby restaurant for dinner. The warm ambiance, soft lighting, and quiet background music created a rare moment of ease between them. For the first time, their conversation flowed without sarcasm or competition. "You handled that well today," James admitted after a brief silence. Emma looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "I didn't know you were capable of giving compliments," she teased. He smirked, slightly embarrassed. "Neither did I, but credit is due when I see something exceptional." Emma relaxed, feeling more at ease than she had in weeks. "You know, James," she said with a playful smile, "sometimes you surprise me. When you're not trying to challenge me, you almost seem human." They both laughed, the usual tension between them shifting into something lighter. But beneath the humor, they both sensed something deeper, something neither of them was ready to acknowledge. The next day, an unexpected technical issue at the branch forced them to work late. By the time they were done, a heavy storm had rolled in, leaving them stranded with no available transportation. With no choice but to wait out the rain, they found themselves in the branch's small lounge, sipping coffee. For the first time, Emma saw a more unguarded side of James. As the evening stretched on, he spoke about the relentless pressure of being CEO, the weight of expectations, and the sacrifices he had made to get where he was. "Sometimes, I wonder if any of it really means anything," he admitted, staring into his coffee cup. Emma watched him for a moment before replying softly, "Maybe the problem isn't what you've built, but what you've chosen to value." James looked at her, caught off guard by the depth of her words. "And you, Emma? Why are you still here, fighting through all this?" She smiled thoughtfully. "Because I believe I can make a difference, and despite everything, I think you can too." The rain continued to pour outside, but the silence between them was filled with something unspoken. When their eyes met, time seemed to slow. James was the first to look away, but the moment lingered in his mind long after. Something inside him had shifted, and he knew it wouldn't be easy to ignore. In the days that followed, they worked together to resolve the branch's issues. To their own surprise, their partnership became unexpectedly seamless. They still exchanged their usual sharp remarks, but beneath them was an unspoken understanding, a growing trust. One evening, after another productive meeting, James walked Emma back to her hotel. As they reached the entrance, they stopped, lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. James hesitated before speaking. "Emma, I need to admit something." She looked at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What is it?" "You make me question a lot of things. About myself, about how I've been living my life." Emma didn't respond right away, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing, James." As Emma stepped inside the hotel, James stood at the entrance, watching her disappear down the hallway. He knew he was falling for her, but whether he was ready to admit it, either to her or to himself, was another matter entirely. Back at Cooper Global's headquarters, James found himself more restless than ever. Since their trip to the European branch, his dynamic with Emma had undeniably changed. Their constant rivalry had given way to moments of mutual admiration, and no matter how much he tried, he He couldn't ignore the feelings that had started to take root. The problem was that acknowledging these feelings meant surrendering control, something he had always prided himself on keeping. Emma, on the other hand, felt the shift too. Though she tried to keep their relationship strictly professional, she couldn't shake the memories of their time on the trip. She had started seeing James as more than just the arrogant, domineering executive she once believed him to be. At their first meeting after returning, the tension between them was undeniable. Emma presented a new project aimed at increasing transparency within the company, which included a significant investment in employee training and benefits. James sat at the opposite end of the table, listening carefully. When she finished, he finally spoke. "Emma, this is ambitious, but you're not accounting for the financial impact. We're still in recovery mode, and adding more costs now isn't feasible." Emma remained calm. "James, we've already demonstrated that investing in employees improves productivity and reduces turnover. This isn't an expense, it's a strategic investment." James let out a low chuckle, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Strategic investment? Sounds more like a reckless gamble that could push us further into financial trouble." Emma felt her frustration rising, but kept her voice steady. "Then what's your solution? Sticking to the same outdated methods that led us here in the first place?" Silence filled the room as the other executives watched the exchange unfold. James finally exhaled and shook his head. "Do what you want, but don't say I didn't warn you." After the meeting, Emma didn't hesitate. She stormed into his office, unannounced. James was seated at his desk, staring at a report he clearly wasn't reading. "Can we talk?" she asked, arms crossed. He looked up, surprised by her directness, but gestured for her to enter. "What is it now?" Emma took a deep breath before responding. "Why are you making things so difficult? You know what I'm proposing is best for the company." James set the report aside and met her gaze. "Maybe because you make me feel like I'm losing control." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and Emma's expression shifted to one of shock. "What do you mean by that?" she asked cautiously. James stood and walked over to the window, struggling to find the right words. "Since you took this position, you've challenged everything I thought I knew about leadership, about how things should be done. And worse, you've made me question things I never wanted to face." Emma's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Maybe that's a good thing, James." He let out a low chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. "Good? It's been driving me insane." The silence between them was thick with tension. Emma finally took a step closer. "Maybe it's time you stop fighting it and start acknowledging what's really happening here." James turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "And what exactly is happening, Emma?" She didn't answer, but in that moment, no words were necessary. That night, Emma was the last one to leave the office. As she walked down the dimly lit hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she found James standing there, looking conflicted yet determined. "Emma," he started, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening." She said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "You've changed everything," he admitted. "I don't know if I'm ready for it, but I know I don't want to fight it anymore." Emma's breath caught in her throat, but she kept her expression steady. "So, what do you want to do, James?" He took a step closer, closing the space between them. "I want to stop pretending I don't care. I want to be honest about how I feel." Before she could respond, James surprised her with a bold move. He reached for her hand, hesitating for only a second, as if silently asking for permission. When she didn't pull away, he leaned in, slowly, deliberately, until their lips met. The kiss was tentative at first, but within it was an unspoken release of all the tension between them. It was a moment of clarity, of something that had been building for far too long. When they finally pulled apart, Emma searched his face, still holding onto his hand. "This changes everything, James." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know, but I think we're ready for it." Emma wasn't sure if he was right. but something inside her told her it was worth the risk. As she left that night, she couldn't shake the way James had looked at her, the raw honesty in his eyes. Something had shifted between them, and she knew there was no going back. The next morning, both tried to focus on their work, pretending nothing had changed. But fate had other plans. A week after the kiss, Emma received an anonymous email. Attached was a series of confidential documents, records of past unethical business practices carried out under James's direct supervision years ago. Though the actions were from the past, if they were exposed, the fallout would be devastating, not just for him, but for the entire company. Emma felt a weight settle in her chest. Confronting James meant risking everything they were starting to build. But ignoring the truth? That would mean betraying everything she stood for. Emma decided to wait for the right moment to address the issue. Meanwhile, James couldn't ignore the shift in her demeanor. In meetings, she remained professional, but something was off. There was a tension in her posture, a distance in her gaze, like she was carrying the weight of something unspoken. When they were alone in the hallway, he finally confronted her. "Emma, is everything okay?" "I'm fine," she replied quickly, avoiding his eyes. "Just focused on work." James narrowed his gaze, unconvinced, but instead of pushing, he let it go. For now. Days later, during a board meeting, everything exploded. The confidential documents Emma had received had been leaked to the press. Headlines spread like wildfire, accusing James of past unethical business practices. The room erupted into chaos as board members demanded immediate answers. Let's play a joke for those who only read the comments. Type "coffee" in the comments. Only those who made it this far will understand. Now, back to the story. James sat frozen for a moment as the voices around him blurred into the background. His mind raced. How had this information gotten out? Then his eyes landed on Emma. A realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "Was it you?" His voice was low, but the accusation was clear. Emma's eyes widened, stunned by his words. "Of course not. Do you really think I would risk everything like this?" James wasn't convinced. "You knew about these documents, didn't you?" Emma hesitated, knowing there was no point in denying it. "Yes, I knew, but I didn't leak them." Disbelief flickered across his face. He shook his head. "You should have come to me, Emma. Instead, you let this happen, and now you expect me to believe you had nothing to do with it?" Before she could answer, a senior board member cut in. "We need solutions, not accusations. Cooper, this could destroy your reputation and take the company down with it." The meeting ended abruptly, but the storm between Emma and James was far from over. Later that evening, James stormed into Emma's office, slamming the door shut behind him. His expression was unreadable, part fury, part betrayal. "You should have trusted me," he snapped. "Instead, you kept this to yourself like some kind of weapon." Emma shot up from her chair, her own frustration boiling over. "Do you seriously think I would do anything to hurt the company?" she countered. "I received the documents anonymously. I was trying to figure out how to handle it without turning it into a disaster." James let out a bitter laugh. "And yet, you managed to cause exactly what you were trying to avoid." He crossed his arms, waiting for her response. Emma took a deep breath, trying to rein in her emotions. She knew this wasn't just about the leaked documents anymore. This was about trust, the fragile kind they had only just started to build. Emma's eyes burned with frustration as she met James's gaze. "You know what your problem is, James? You don't trust anyone but yourself." James clenched his jaw, but she wasn't done. "You're so convinced that everyone around you is trying to take something from you that you don't see the ones who are actually trying to help. Not everyone is a threat to your precious control." James stepped closer, his expression dark and unreadable. "And you don't understand what it's like to bear the weight of all this," he countered. "It's not just a company, Emma. It's my life." She refused to back down. "Maybe it's time you stopped acting like everything revolves around you." A heavy silence filled the room, the tension between them reaching a breaking point. James finally exhaled sharply and stepped back, shaking his head. I think I made a mistake," he muttered. "I should have never let this get personal." His words hit Emma like a slap. She folded her arms over her chest, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "Maybe you're right." James didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of her office without looking back. For the days that followed, Emma and James barely spoke. The company was in crisis, and both were consumed with damage control. But even in the chaos, the silence between them was unbearable. Despite her anger, Emma couldn't ignore the truth. What they had, whatever it was, had been real. And even now, after their fight, she still felt the weight of his absence. James, on his end, was torn. He didn't want to admit it, but he missed her. He missed her presence, her challenges, the way she forced him to think differently. Then, the truth about the leak came out. An internal investigation revealed that the confidential documents had been sent to the press by one of James's longtime allies, an executive who had been quietly plotting to overthrow him as CEO. When the news broke, James felt a mix of relief and guilt. He had been wrong about Emma. One evening, unable to ignore the need to make things right, he knocked on her office door. When she looked up and saw him standing there, she was visibly surprised. "I found out who leaked the documents," he said, his voice subdued. Emma studied him carefully. "And it wasn't you," he added, regret laced in his tone. She didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. James hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "I was wrong to doubt you." Emma remained composed, but her voice was firm. "You doubted me because you've never seen me as an equal," she said. "You've always believed you were above me, James, and that's what needs to change." He nodded, knowing she was right. "You're right, and I want to change that, if you'll give me the chance." Emma studied him for a long moment before answering. "I'll think about it." Though their wounds were still fresh, they both knew that conversation had been a step toward rebuilding what had been broken. As James left, Emma realized something. This time, for the first time, he genuinely wanted to change. A week passed, and while Emma and James worked side by side, they barely exchanged words beyond the professional necessities. The weight of everything that had happened still lingered. Then, an unexpected opportunity for reconciliation appeared. A grand gala was scheduled for Cooper Global's top investors and partners. It was an elegant affair, set in a stunning garden with string lights draped over the trees and classical music floating through the air. Emma arrived alone, wearing a sleek black dress that exuded confidence and sophistication. Her hair was swept into an elegant updo, and the slight curve of her lips carried an undeniable presence. As soon as she entered, heads turned. James, who was already at the event, caught the hushed murmurs of admiration. Curious, he turned toward the entrance, only to find himself completely breathless. Emma looked different that night, not just beautiful, but commanding. It wasn't just the way the soft lights played against her features, or how effortlessly she moved through the crowd. It was something deeper, the quiet power she carried, the unwavering self-assurance. James watched as she greeted investors, her laughter easy, her conversation effortless. She had always been captivating, but tonight it was impossible to ignore. For the first time, he felt something he wasn't used to: vulnerability. And he knew, no matter how much he had resisted, he needed to talk to her. After watching her from a distance for far too long, he finally made his move. He found her near one of the tables, speaking with a small group of investors. As he approached, the group slowly drifted away, leaving them alone. "Emma," he said, his voice lower than usual, "can we talk?" She hesitated, as if considering whether or not to give him the time, but in the end, she nodded. "Sure." James led her outside, away from the crowd, to a quiet garden path illuminated by soft candlelight. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the distant hum of music created a moment that felt almost unreal. They stopped beneath an ivy-covered arch, the air between them charged with something unspoken. James turned to her, visibly nervous, a rare sight. "You look incredible tonight," he admitted before he could stop himself. Emma smiled, but her expression remained guarded. "Thank you, James." but I doubt that's why you brought me out here." He let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "No, it's not." He took a breath, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about how I handled things, and how I let it all spiral out of control." Emma crossed her arms, waiting for him to continue. "I was an idiot," he said, shaking his head. "Doubting you was my biggest mistake, but what scares me the most isn't just that." He stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "It's the fact that since the moment I met you, you've been changing the way I see everything." His gaze locked onto hers, unwavering. "And honestly, that terrifies me." Emma blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. "James," she started, but he held up a hand. "No, let me finish." He swallowed hard. "You make me want to be better, and I don't know what to do with that, except to finally say it." He hesitated, then took another step toward her, closing the space between them. "I need you, Emma, in every way." Before she could respond, James searched her face, waiting, hoping. James leaned in and kissed her again. This time, it was deeper, more certain, filled with the unspoken emotions he had been holding back for so long. His hands gently cupped her face, as if afraid to break the fragile moment between them. Emma kissed him back, feeling a rush of emotions she couldn't quite put into words. When they finally pulled away, they stood there in silence, breathing steadily under the glow of the stars. Before either of them could speak, an assistant hurried toward them. "Mr. Cooper, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something urgent that needs your attention." James exhaled heavily, reluctant, but knowing he had no choice but to deal with the matter. He turned to Emma, his eyes holding something deeper than he could express. "Don't go anywhere. I'll be back as soon as I can." Emma nodded, watching as he walked away. She stayed in the garden, trying to process everything that had just happened. 10 minutes later, James returned, but something had changed. His expression was tense, his usual confidence shaken. "What happened?" Emma asked, instantly on alert. James's voice was lower now, edged with concern. "One of the investors is trying to take advantage of the recent crisis," he said. "They're attempting to acquire a significant share of the company, to influence the board against me." Emma frowned. "Who?" James hesitated before answering. "Oliver Hayes." Emma's breath caught. Oliver had always supported her initiatives, had always seemed like an ally. The thought of him working against James, and possibly against her, felt like a betrayal. "That makes sense," she admitted, shaking her head. "Oliver has always been strategic, but I never imagined he'd make a move like this." James ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "I don't know how to handle this without creating an even bigger mess." Emma reached out, lightly touching his arm, drawing his gaze back to hers. "We'll handle it together, James." In the days that followed, Emma and James worked side by side, countering Oliver's actions. They gathered support within the board, strategized their next moves, and presented a plan that not only protected James's position, but also strengthened the company's standing amidst the turmoil. Through it all, something shifted between them. Their partnership became more seamless, their trust in each other more solid. One evening, after another successful meeting, James walked Emma to her office door. Before she could step inside, he reached for her hand. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice unusually soft, "I don't want to lose what we have." Emma smiled, knowing this was the most honest James had ever been with her. One morning, while Emma was reviewing reports in her office, she received a message from James. "I need you with me tonight. Be ready for something special." Emma stared at the message, intrigued. James never made invitations without a clear agenda. That evening, she arrived at the address he had sent her, a luxurious restaurant in the heart of the city. Inside, she found James waiting for her at a private table. He was impeccably dressed, and the atmosphere was intimate, the room softly lit by candlelight. "What's all this, James?" Emma asked as she sat down. He smirked slightly. "I figured we deserved one night without charts, reports, or crises." Emma relaxed slightly, but still eyed him with curiosity. The evening was surprisingly light. They shared old memories, laughed about past conflicts, and for once, allowed themselves to enjoy each other's company, without the weight of work hanging over them. But as dinner neared its end, James's demeanor changed. His expression grew serious. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. Emma leaned in slightly, sensing the weight of his words. James took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been approached with an offer, a merger with an international firm. It's a major opportunity, but there's a catch." Emma's stomach tightened. "What kind of catch?" James hesitated, then finally said it. "It would mean stepping away from Cooper Global for at least a year to oversee negotiations and integration." Emma felt her breath hitch. "And you want to accept?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's best for the company. This deal could secure its future, stabilize everything we've worked for." Emma looked at him, processing his words, realizing that, for the first time, the future they had both started to imagine together might be changing before it even had a chance to begin. Emma knew James was right. This opportunity could change everything for the company, securing its future, but the thought of him stepping away, of not having him by her side, felt like a loss she wasn't ready to face. Despite all the obstacles, they had built something together, something real. Moving forward without him felt daunting. "Does this mean we won't have this anymore?" she asked hesitantly. James reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "I don't know what the future will look like," he admitted, "but I do know this. This doesn't change how I feel about you." The next morning, as Emma tried to process everything, another unexpected challenge surfaced. Oliver Hayes had called for an emergency board meeting. His agenda was clear. He was proposing to take over James's position in his absence, a strategic power move that could shift the entire company under his control. Emma arrived at the meeting with one goal: to protect the foundation she and James had built. During the discussion, Oliver subtly criticized the current leadership, painting a picture of instability. "I believe it's time for a bolder, more modern approach," he declared smoothly. Emma had heard enough. "With all due respect, Mr. Hayes," she interrupted, her voice unwavering, "your version of boldness seems to disregard the values we've worked so hard to restore. This company needs consistency and integrity, not a power grab." Oliver's smile remained, but irritation flickered in his eyes. "And who do you suggest should take on that responsibility in James's absence?" he challenged. "Yourself?" The room fell into silence. Emma knew this was a defining moment. She could step back and let Oliver take control, or she could fight for everything she believed in. She slowly rose from her seat, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "If necessary," she said firmly, "yes, I'll step up." Later that evening, Emma went to James's office. He had already heard the news. "Did you really tell the board you'd take over the company?" he asked, his tone a mix of surprise and admiration. Emma met his gaze, unwavering. "I won't let Oliver turn this company into his personal empire," she said. "We worked too hard to build something meaningful. I'm not letting him tear it apart." James stepped closer, his expression serious. He took her hands in his. "You know this means more pressure, more challenges." "I know," she replied, "but I also know it's worth it." He looked at her for a long moment, as if taking in just how strong she truly was. "You're incredible," he finally said. Emma smiled. "I'm just doing what's right." The night before the board's final decision, James invited Emma to meet him again. This time, he took her to a secluded pier where a yacht awaited them. "I thought we could use a little fresh air before making big decisions," he said, as the boat gently glided across the water, the city lights flickering in the distance. They talked for a while, the tension of the past few weeks momentarily lifting, but as James fell silent, his expression grew more serious. "Emma," he said, turning to her, "there's something I need to ask you before I leave." She watched, puzzled, as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Her breath caught. "I know things between us started complicated," he admitted. "But you've changed the way I see the world. and I don't want to lose that." He opened the box, revealing a ring. "I want you by my side, no matter where I am," he said. Emma's heart pounded. Are you proposing?" she whispered. James held her gaze. "Yes. Emma, will you stay with me? Not just in the company, but in life?" She felt a rush of emotions: fear, excitement, love. But when she smiled, she already knew her answer. "Yes, James." As the waves lapped gently against the boat, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. After James's unexpected proposal, Emma felt like her world had shifted. Her yes had come from an undeniable feeling, but as reality settled in, so did the pressure. With James preparing to leave the company for a year and the board's expectations weighing heavily on her, their promise to stay together suddenly felt fragile. The next day, Emma returned to the office, ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. But the situation was worsening. Leaks to the media continued to stir rumors, and Oliver Hayes was relentless in his attempts to undermine her authority. Despite everything, she remained determined to prove she was capable of leading Cooper Global in James's absence. Her first major challenge came immediately. Oliver had called a meeting, and as soon as she stepped into the room, she knew what was coming. With his usual air of superiority, he leaned back in his chair and addressed the board. "With all due respect, Ms. Taylor, I believe your leadership approach is overly optimistic, given the current crisis," he said smoothly. "Perhaps a more seasoned executive should handle investor relations." Emma had prepared for this. "Optimism isn't the problem, Mr. Hayes," she responded calmly. "The real issue is a lack of commitment to long-term stability. Investors aren't looking for quick fixes. They want results they can trust. That's exactly what I'm here to deliver." Oliver's expression didn't falter, but she could tell he wasn't finished. With a smirk, he slid a folder across the table toward her. "Then perhaps," he said, "you can explain why some of your recent projects are already over budget. That doesn't exactly inspire confidence." Emma opened the folder and immediately realized what he had done. The numbers had been altered, manipulated to make it seem as though her initiatives were failing. It was a calculated, underhanded move. "These figures are inaccurate," she said, her voice unwavering. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "If someone is attempting to falsify data, they should reconsider before this becomes public." The tension in the room was suffocating. Oliver didn't respond, but the flicker in his eyes told her he wasn't backing down. While Emma battled the board, James faced his own struggle. Tied up in endless negotiations for the merger, he found his thoughts drifting back to her, back to the fight she was taking on alone. He knew he had to leave, but the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if he was making the right decision. That evening, instead of heading home, he returned to the office. When he stepped into Emma's office, he found her buried under stacks of reports, exhaustion written all over her face. "I thought you were taking time off tonight," he said, leaning against the doorway. Emma looked up, surprised but relieved to see him. "I can't afford to take a break while Oliver is trying to tear me down," she said. "He's playing dirty, James." James walked over to her, gently taking her hand in his. "You're not in this alone, Emma," he said quietly. "I'm not letting him get away with this." For the first time in days, she allowed herself to exhale. No matter how uncertain the future felt, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't fighting this battle alone. Emma exhaled, feeling a small fraction of the weight on her shoulders lift. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I can't rely on you for everything. If I want to lead, I need to face this on my own." James studied her for a moment, admiration flickering in his eyes. "You already are," he said with a small smile. "And you're doing it better than anyone could have imagined." That evening, James invited Emma to dinner, hoping to pull her away from the stress of work, even if just for a little while. He chose a quiet, intimate restaurant where they could talk without the looming pressures of the office. At first, their conversation revolved around work, but as the night went on, it drifted into something more personal. "Have you ever thought about where we'd be now if that night at the gala hadn't happened?" James asked, his tone playful. Emma laughed, shaking her head. We'd probably still hate each other. James smirked. Or at least pretending to. The warmth between them was undeniable, a reminder of how much had changed. But just as they began to truly relax, Emma's phone buzzed. She hesitated, but, seeing the name of a trusted executive, decided to answer. Emma, you need to get back to the office. Something urgent has come up. She met James's gaze, concern flashing in her eyes. Looks like our break is over. When they arrived at the office, the situation had escalated. More confidential documents had been leaked, this time revealing sensitive internal plans about the company's future. The media had already picked up the story, and investors were demanding immediate answers. Emma quickly scanned the leaked files, her stomach twisting. The timing, the nature of the leaks. It was all calculated to undermine her leadership. James, reading over her shoulder, didn't hesitate. This is Oliver's doing, he said firmly. Emma clenched her jaw, trying to keep her composure. He's trying to destroy my credibility and consolidate his control over the board, James continued, his voice sharp with frustration. Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then we need to act before he succeeds. That night, Emma and James worked tirelessly, poring over every detail, searching for a way to counteract the damage. They needed undeniable proof, evidence that could directly link Oliver to the leaks. It would take time, patience, and careful strategy. But through the chaos, something between them strengthened. Despite the high stakes, the exhaustion, and the relentless pressure, they found solace in each other. Side by side, they weren't just fighting for the company. They were fighting for something much more. James leaned back, watching Emma with an expression that was both impressed and thoughtful. Emma, do you realize you're handling this better than I ever could? She looked up, surprised. I never thought I'd hear that from you, she admitted. He smiled, shaking his head slightly. You amaze me every day. By dawn, Emma finally found what they needed. Undeniable proof. A string of emails from Oliver to a journalist detailed the leaked documents and outlined his strategy for seizing control. Emma turned to James, holding up the printed pages. We've got him? James took the documents, scanning them quickly. A slow smile of pride spread across his face. I knew you would, he said, admiration clear in his voice. Emma exhaled, knowing the battle wasn't over. But for the first time, she felt like they had a real advantage. Now, it was only a matter of time before Oliver was exposed. The office was eerily quiet as Emma and James pored over the incriminating emails. Line after line confirmed what they had suspected. Oliver had been manipulating information and orchestrating leaks to undermine their leadership. Relief flickered through them, but they both knew this wasn't over. James sat back, crossing his arms, watching Emma as she studied every detail with intense focus. He could see the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, but her determination never wavered. If anything, it made him admire her even more. Still, concern lingered in his gaze. If we expose this the wrong way, he'll retaliate, James said, breaking the silence. Emma looked up from the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her expression hardened with resolution. Then we need allies, she said. We can't take him down alone. We need to bring in the people who've seen what he's capable of and show them how his actions are putting the company at risk. James nodded, impressed by her clarity. The plan made sense, but it also put them in a vulnerable position. Trust within the board was already shaky, and convincing neutral members to pick a side would be a challenge. They spent the next several hours compiling evidence, organizing the emails, and creating a detailed report to present to the board. As midnight approached, Emma finally closed the last document, exhaling deeply. James watched her from across the room, silent for a moment, as if measuring the weight of everything she was carrying. You should rest, he said as he walked over. Emma gave him a tired but determined smile. I can't rest while he's still out there. James reached out gently, tilting her chin so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. You don't have to carry this alone, Emma, he said, his voice softer now. We're in this together. Remember that? She felt the sincerity in his words and nodded slightly. It wasn't easy for her to lean on someone else, but somehow, with James, it felt safe, even in the middle of chaos. The next morning, Emma and James arrived at the office before any of the other executives. They knew they had no time to waste. They called an emergency meeting with the undecided board members, ready to present the truth, and finally put an end to Oliver's game. When the board members finally gathered, Emma stood at the front of the room, holding the dossier firmly in her hands. "Thank you all for coming so early. What I have to say isn't easy, but it's necessary," she began, her voice steady and unwavering. She laid out the evidence methodically, presenting how Oliver had misused internal information to manipulate decisions, sabotage James's leadership, and create instability within the company. The room remained silent as the board members absorbed the weight of her words. It was undeniable. Oliver's actions hadn't just harmed the company's reputation, but they had jeopardized the future of every employee working there. When Emma finished, Robert McCain, one of the most senior members of the board, cleared his throat. "This is a serious accusation," he said gravely. "We need to verify that this evidence is authentic before taking any further action." James immediately stepped in, his voice firm. "I've personally reviewed every document. If there's any doubt, we can bring in external experts for verification. But let's be clear, Oliver's actions have already put this company at risk. This isn't just speculation, it's fact." A ripple of unease spread through the board. Some members nodded in agreement, while others hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of confronting Oliver directly. Emma knew they needed to act now. She took a step forward, her expression resolute. "I understand that this is difficult, but turning a blind eye makes us complicit. If we want to lead with integrity, we have to take action before it's too late." Her words struck a chord. Slowly, one by one, board members began voicing their support. Only a few remained hesitant, but it was clear. The majority were on Emma and James's side. As the meeting concluded, Emma felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. They had taken a crucial step, but the fight wasn't over yet. As the room emptied, James remained by her side. "You were brilliant," he said. Emma exhaled, the tension still lingering. "I hope it's enough." James took her hands in his touch grounding her. "It was more than enough. You're leading this in a way few could." She met his gaze, seeing the genuine pride in his eyes. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget the pressure, feeling grateful to have him by her side. That night, while reviewing the next steps at home, Emma's phone buzzed with a message from James. "Whatever happens, you've already proven you're more than capable. Never doubt that." Emma smiled at the screen, feeling a renewed confidence. But she knew the final confrontation with Oliver was still ahead, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. The boardroom was packed, but the tension made it feel suffocatingly silent. Emma stood in the center, holding the dossier, the undeniable proof of Oliver Hayes' deception. James stood beside her, his eyes locked on Oliver, who sat lounging in his leather chair, exuding false confidence. It was clear he believed nothing could touch him. Emma took a steady breath and began. "In the past few weeks, Cooper International has faced internal threats that have compromised its integrity and leadership," she stated. "Today, I present evidence that these threats didn't come from the outside, but from someone within this very room." With precise movements, she opened the dossier and projected the damning documents onto the screen. Emails, altered financial reports, confidential leaks. Piece by piece, she laid it all out, each document directly tying Oliver to his calculated attempts to dismantle leadership and seize control. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy with each revelation. For the first time, Oliver's usual smirk faded. He tried to maintain his composure, but there was a flicker of unease in his expression. When Emma finished, silence stretched across the boardroom like a held breath. Then, Oliver stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "These documents have clearly been manipulated. There's no concrete proof that I did anything wrong." James leaned forward, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Manipulated?" he repeated. "We have digital records confirming the authenticity of these documents. This isn't about opinions, Oliver. It's about facts." Oliver let out a forced laugh, but there was a slight tremor in his voice. "And what exactly do you plan to do? Remove me without a full investigation? You need me to stabilize this company." Emma met his gaze without flinching. "We don't need someone who puts their own interests above the company," she said firmly. "And we certainly don't need you to stabilize anything. We've already done that, without you." A wave of murmurs spread through the board members. The balance was shifting. Oliver scanned the room, searching for support, but he found none. No one was willing to defend him. Finally, Robert McCain rose from his seat, his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence speaks for itself. I propose we hold an immediate vote for the removal of Oliver Hayes and forward this matter to the appropriate legal authorities." The vote was swift and unanimous. Oliver was officially stripped of his position at Cooper International. As security was called in to escort him out, the weight in the room seemed to lift. Oliver stood motionless for a moment, his expression unreadable, before casting one final glance at Emma and James, his eyes filled with resentment. But neither of them wavered. Without another word, he turned and walked out. As the boardroom emptied, Emma finally exhaled. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by exhaustion and relief. James remained beside her, watching as the last board member left. She turned to him, her shoulders sagging slightly. "It's over," she murmured. James smiled, placing a hand on her back. "You did it, Emma." She looked at him, knowing that while this battle was won, there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of them, because she wasn't facing them alone. James stepped toward Emma, taking her hands in his and holding them tightly. "You did it. You saved the company." Emma smiled, but the exhaustion in her eyes was unmistakable. "I didn't do it alone. I couldn't have done it without you." James gave her a soft, knowing smile and leaned in slightly. "I think we make a great team." That evening, James took Emma out to celebrate, a well-earned moment of peace after weeks of relentless pressure. He chose a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city, where the dim lights and cool night breeze set the perfect atmosphere. It wasn't just about marking their victory, it was about acknowledging what they had built, not just in business, but between them. As they raised their glasses for a toast, James reached across the table, gently holding Emma's hand. "You know, after everything we've been through, I'm not going anywhere," he said. Emma chuckled, shaking her head. "I thought you were set on pursuing the international merger?" she teased. James sighed, looking at her with a rare vulnerability. "The merger can wait. What we have here is more important." Her heart skipped a beat. James had always put work first, always prioritized control, strategy, and business above all else. Hearing him say this felt like a defining moment. Before she could respond, he leaned in and kissed her softly. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a promise. For the first time, they both felt like the future was truly in their hands. Months later, Cooper International was thriving under their leadership. The reforms they had fought for weren't just improving finances. They were transforming the company's culture, fostering trust, and creating a place where employees felt valued. Emma led with confidence and empathy, while James embraced a new kind of leadership, one that wasn't just about control, but about trust, vision, and collaboration. One evening, as they worked late in the office, Emma looked over at James and asked, "Do you ever regret staying?" James stepped closer, his expression softening. "Never," he said. "Staying was the best decision I ever made." They stood in silence for a moment, simply enjoying the peace of knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. The months that followed were transformative, not just for the company, but for them. Cooper International continued to flourish, shaped by James's strategic mind and Emma's people-centered approach. The struggles they had faced now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by something deeper and more lasting. James knew his life had changed the moment Emma walked into it. She hadn't just reshaped his views on leadership, she had shown him what it meant to truly let someone in. One quiet evening, standing on the terrace of their apartment, James made a decision. Taking her hand gently, he said, "Emma, from the moment I met you, you challenged everything I believed in. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me." Emma smiled, sensing the emotion in his voice. "I can't imagine my life without you anymore," he continued. "You're my partner in everything. Work, life, whatever comes next. So, I have one question." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring. "Will you marry me?" Emma gasped, covering her mouth in surprise. Though she had known how much they loved each other, she hadn't expected this moment. Not yet. Not like this. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, James, I will." As he slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss, the city lights sparkled around them, witnessing the most significant moment of their lives. Their wedding took place a few months later, a simple yet elegant ceremony held in a lush garden filled with white flowers beneath a bright blue sky. It was an intimate gathering of close friends, family, and a few trusted colleagues from the company. The air was filled with joy, laughter, and the quiet certainty that this was exactly where they were meant to be. Emma looked stunning in a classic lace gown that highlighted her natural elegance, but it was her radiance, the quiet confidence and happiness in her eyes, that took James's breath away. As she walked toward him, each step felt meaningful, a reminder of everything they had been through, the struggles, the battles, the late nights filled with tension, and the quiet moments where love had grown despite it all. At the altar, the officiant began speaking, but to Emma and James, the world had faded away. They only saw each other. When it was time to exchange vows, James's voice was steady, but his eyes held raw emotion. "Emma, you're not just the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. You're the reason I believe love can change everything. You've taught me that true strength isn't just about standing alone, but about trusting, sharing, and growing together. I promise to stand by your side through every moment, easy or difficult. You are my home, my partner, my love." A tear slipped down Emma's cheek as she squeezed his hands. When it was her turn, she spoke with quiet certainty. "James, you've shown me that even the most guarded hearts can open. You taught me that strength isn't just about facing challenges alone, but about facing them together. I promise to love you every day of our lives, to support your choices, and to build a life with you that's worthy of everything we've already started." As they exchanged rings, the guests erupted in applause, but Emma and James only had eyes for each other. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, James leaned in, kissing her deeply, sealing a promise that went beyond words. A promise of love, trust, and an unshakable partnership. The reception was filled with warmth and celebration. Friends and family toasted to their happiness, sharing stories, some humorous, some touching, about the journey that had led them here. James, usually reserved, surprised everyone with an unexpected speech. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But more than that, I want to thank Emma for changing my life. You are the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I hope everyone in this room finds something as special as what I've found with you." Emma smiled, embracing him as the crowd cheered. Under the twinkling garden lights, they danced, lost in each other, knowing that this was only the beginning. That night, as the last guests departed and the stars stretched endlessly above them, Emma and James sat together in the quiet of the garden, holding hands. No words were needed, because in that moment they knew, together they could face anything. What do you think? Was Emma right to trust James? Share your thoughts in the comments and rate the story from 0 to 10. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more touching stories like this one. Click here to watch more.